Same old game over. Johnny.
You're gonna need a bigger boat. Why so serious? Roll out.
I am Iron Man. This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the In Session Film Podcast.
Welcome to this podcast review for November 12th, 2024, and I'm JD Duran.
And I'm Brendan Cassidy.
Hey, thanks for joining us, everybody, for a conversation that we have been looking forward to for quite some time.
Award season, baby.
I don't recall, Brendan, if Anora was on your most anticipated list at the beginning of the year.
You know, that's a great question. I'm glad you brought that up because I meant to look that up before this episode, and I totally forgot to do that. We may have to pull that list up just to confirm things.
Yeah, I'm looking at mine now, and it isn't quite in my top 10.
Okay.
But I'd have to go back because I don't really remember. Was this something that was supposed to come out last year, or maybe we thought was going to come out last year and got pushed to this year? Was that part of the story? Because
it may have. We did have it in our honorable mentions. I know that.
Yes, I have it listed here. Like if I was going to extend beyond 10, and because at the beginning of the year we do our top 10 most anticipated movies of the year, and this, according to the list I have here that I did back in January, would have been like around 12. But given our history with Sean Baker, I just wonder if there's further context, but I can't remember if this was something we talked about in 2023 at all. And maybe it wasn't. Maybe
I think it was. I think it was maybe one of those. It may have been one of those cases where the official release for this movie was not quite confirmed for us at that point.
Maybe that's what it was.
We just didn't quite know. And I've done that many times when we do our most anticipated for a given year. Is that my criteria? Is I tend to look at movies that I feel pretty confident are actually coming out that year. And that's sometimes hard to gauge for movies that are going through the independent circuit first or the festival circuit first. They could actually get a proper release the next year, and we've seen that happen many times.
Yeah, and I should probably take that approach. I feel like I get so giddy with projects from filmmakers that I love.
Yeah,
that
you can't put Terrence Malick on your list anymore.
Because that just inevitably always happens. The Way of the Wind is simply going to be my number one forever until it comes out, and God knows when that's going to happen. So
I feel like you've acknowledged that film on every most anticipated episode for the past 4 years.
I know. I'm going to have to leave that off because I got burned this year, I think more than any other year doing that list, because it wasn't just Malick. It was also Kirsten Johnson. That documentary did not come out. Warner Brothers screwed me with Bong Joon-ho as well. The Leo Carax film that I had on my list, I didn't even realize was a short film. And I do think that played at some festivals, but it's only like a 35-minute short, which I did not realize that when I was putting that list together. So I would have made changes if I would have known how the year was going to play out. And Anora would have likely ended up in that top 10, I guess, is the point I'm ultimately trying to make here.
I think same here, especially if we had known. I mean, it would have been impossible to know then, but if we had known it was going to garner this type of buzz, especially winning the Palme d'Or at the Cannes Film Festival, which is, I think we talked about this. This is the first American film to win the Palme d'Or at the Cannes Film Festival since The Tree of Life, bringing it back to Terrence Malick once again. That's a pretty interesting feat, nonetheless.
Yeah, absolutely. Sean Baker is a filmmaker we quite love. Especially The Florida Project. That was both in Brendan and I's top 5 for that year. I think it sits at number 3 for me for that year, if I recall correctly. I'd have to go back and double check that, but I want to say it's number 3 for me.
That was in my top 10 of the decade.
Yeah, it was really, really high for you. And honestly, I'm not too far behind you. I think it's also one of the best films of the last 10 years. It's right up there. Like my trio for that year was Get Out, Lady Bird, The Florida Project.
It's a good trio.
Pretty much the same about all 3 of those films, right? I think they're all masterpieces in their own right. So in many ways, they are interchangeable. So I'm with you. I think The Florida Project is one of the best films of not just the 2010s, maybe of the century so far. I think it is an American masterpiece for sure. And I really loved Red Rocket, maybe more so than a lot of other critics. You and I had that in our top 20. I think you were maybe even a little higher than I was.
That was my number 3 that year.
Yeah. Remember you had a little higher than me. I think it sat around number 12 for me, something like that. So I was still quite high on it. And yeah, that's a film that's only
gotten better.
That's only aged better. In my mind as the years have gone on.
Yeah.
So yes, I was deeply excited for Anora coming off the heels of those. And I don't want to forget Tangerine. I really loved Tangerine as well. So since he's come on the scene with Tangerine, I know he had a few independent films prior to Tangerine, but that's
which
when
we
he
have not
really
seen.
came onto the scene in a big way. I'm with you. I haven't seen any of those either.
I heard
But
good things about
Tangerine's
Starlet, though.
Say that again.
I've heard good things about Starlet, which was the film that came
Yes.
directly before Tangerine. I hope to catch up with it someday.
Yeah, that's one I would like to see as well. But his last 3, I think he has aced all of them to varying degrees. Anora was certainly among my most anticipated for the year, which is why I was maybe a little surprised and delighted that Anora was getting all of the recognition it did. It obviously ended up winning the Palme d'Or, which, forgive me, maybe you can help me out here, Brennan. It was the second American film to win that award in how many years? I'm trying to recall the exact stat.
Well,
off the cuff here.
Because since the last film was The Tree of Life, if I'm not mistaken, that's been, 13 years? Something like that? The Tree of Life was released in 2011. I think it
it was
premiered
the
at
first
Cannes,
film
and
to win the Palme d'Or since The Tree of Life.
Okay, so then,
it's been a
so
little
it had to
while.
have been 13 years.
Yep. So it's been 13 years since The Tree of Life, which is crazy. Like,
Yeah.
the fact that that a Sean Baker film is in the awards conversation, it does surprise me because he makes movies that aren't always in alignment with how the Academy typically thinks and how they vote. So when this film started to get that recognition and that kind of buzz, I wasn't sure what to expect. I was excited. I was like, okay, Sean Baker is finally getting the
It's like,
the recognition he deserves.
After Red Rocket, he's made a film that apparently everybody loves.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, because Red Rocket, even more so than the Florida Project, and the Florida Project was also divisive.
Yeah.
It was not wholly received. Red Rocket was even more polarized.
Yeah.
So the fact that Anora seems to be more universally accepted or praised, at least comparatively, that hyped me up. I wanted to see what that was about.
Interesting. Very interesting.
Very interesting. We'll talk about how that works, how that impacts his career, how that might even contrast his last 2 outings in some ways. So all of that to say, we were excited for this movie.
Yeah.
So without further ado, are we ready to jump in here?
Let's talk about this thing. Let's get into it.
Okay. All right. So the film, of course, is written and directed by Sean Baker. It stars Mikey Madison, Mark Eidelstein. I'm not sure if that's how you say it.
I've heard a few different pronunciations.
Certainly,
Yeah.
my American
Edelstein,
butchering
I think
of it.
Edelstein is something I've heard before, but I don't
Edelstein.
know if it's true. But needless
Yeah.
to say, he plays Ivan, the
Ivan.
object of Annie's
Yeah.
affection here.
Mark Eidelstein. I think that is a fair pronunciation. We can certainly go with.
Okay.
And Yura Borisov, we'll be talking about him as well.
For sure.
If you're not familiar with Anora, it is about, you guessed it, Anora, who also goes by Annie in the film. She is a young sex worker from Brooklyn. She meets and impulsively marries the son of a Russian oligarch. Once the news reaches Russia, her fairy tale is threatened as his parents set out for New York to get the marriage annulled. Okay.
Very sitcom-y plot synopsis there, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's get into this. Brendan, what did you think about Sean Baker's latest in Anora?
So in that intro, JD, you posed a bit of a question there, how this film was going to shake up in contrast to Sean Baker's previous films, and maybe also simultaneously asking the question, why is it this one that people are responding to? And I think as we talk about this movie, we're going to find that the answer is this is his most accessible movie. But it still feels very much like a Sean Baker film. This is very much like when your favorite indie artist starts to go a little bit more mainstream, when they start to get some hit radio singles, right? And people start to take notice, but they haven't abandoned their core sound or their ethos. So if this is the kind of movie that Sean Baker's going to get noticed for, I'm here for it. I really am, because I do think this is maybe his most entertaining movie. This might be his film thus far that he's made where I'm most likely going to revisit the most, because I do think it is very entertaining and often endearing. We'll talk about these performances and why that is. I don't think it's quite as provocative or challenging as his previous films, though, which I guess comes with the territory when you're making something that is a bit more accessible in that regard. I don't think the film divulges in his usual trademarks as much, even though they are here. You know, his trademark being tackling a certain American population that's a bit off the beaten path, on the fringes of sorts. And that is definitely represented here. You know, the idea of sex work in Brooklyn is definitely part of this, but it does feel more like Sean Baker's trying to challenge the form of a certain genre film as opposed to a certain like topical demographic, which I do think is still very interesting. And I think in that regard, the film is very effective. And like I said, very entertaining. I'm going to be revisiting this movie. It might be my least favorite Sean Baker film of the four that I've seen thus far. I admittedly do need to revisit Tangerine. It's been a while since I've seen that one. But I can safely say I prefer The Florida Project. I prefer Red Rocket at this point. But that's interesting to say that for a film like Anora that might still be my least favorite of his thus far, it's still among my favorites of the year. I don't know if it'll end up in my top 10 by the time we get to our award show. It could. I'm just not, I guess I'm trying to temper my expectations given the hype around this movie. I'm not here saying that I think it's the movie of the year. I'm not quite there with it yet. But I am excited to revisit it, which is a huge compliment I can give it. And I'm glad that Sean Baker is doing something like this that is as entertaining as it is while still feeling very much like a Sean Baker film. So I like that approach and how he's able to get away with that.
Yeah, I think this film is a lot of fun. I am completely with you. This is Sean Baker's most diverting film to date. It is his most aggressively comedic thus far. I mean, that middle section where they are looking for Ivan is almost slapstick at times.
It's absurd.
There's always a humorous core to his films, but Anora certainly has more embedded into its DNA, and it is a wild ride. However, as a result, I don't think it quite reaches the same depths for me as his last two outings. In fact, there were large swaths of this film where it seemed as if it might be my least favorite of his by a wide margin, even if I was quite enjoying the levity of it.
Sure.
But that said, this is a film that, in pure Sean Baker form, completely sticks the landing and wholly recontextualizes everything for me. This film quintessentially demonstrates why you have to reserve judgment until the very end, because that final scene is stunning with Annie's catharsis and how that comes about and what that means for her given the choices that she makes throughout the film, which we'll absolutely get into more as this conversation goes. It is an incredible moment that not only gives the film a much needed emotional boost, but it makes sense of Baker's seemingly conventional storytelling. Not enough good things can be said about Mikey Madison. She is electric in her performance. She's fiery. She's magnetic. She's fully committed physically to the role, which gives the film a remarkable energy throughout, especially as Annie begins to unravel in certain parts in the back half. And again, that ending, the sudden shift in Annie emotionally is incredible. Absolutely remarkable. And I really, really love Yura Borisev here as well. I absolutely
We'll talk
want to
about Igor. We will talk about Igor for sure.
Yeah, we will talk about Igor. Yes, I'm with you, Brendan. This film is his most accessible, which in hindsight makes sense of why this film is getting all of that Oscar buzz.
Yeah.
Whereas The Florida Project, Red Rocket, Tangerine, given those films and how he goes about making those films, they are more challenging, they're more provocative, and that doesn't align with Oscar voting a lot of the time.
Right.
So it's a little disappointing in that regard, because I do think of the films he's made so far, The Florida Project especially is the film that really deserved to be recognized in terms of awards recognition.
Yeah.
But that said, as we've said many a times for many directors, right? You think of something like Martin Scorsese. Did he win an Oscar for his best work? Absolutely not. Was it for his entire career to that point? Yes, that's why he won that Oscar.
Well, yeah, I think that's
Sean
fair.
Baker, and look, I understand the comparison isn't exactly apples to apples, but you get my point in the sense that Anora is going to be in the awards, and I think on its own terms, it's deserving for sure in the context of 2024. But I think more than anything else, at least in my mind, how I'm choosing to look at it, it isn't his best work, but it's kind of an accumulation of the great work he's done over the last 7-8 years now that has led to this moment that deserves to be recognized. And the Florida Project walked so Anora could run.
Yeah, and I've seen a few critics make that statement that Anora does feel like a culmination or a buffet of everything that Sean Baker's done before. Maybe just simply stripping back on some of those provocative tendencies that you and I responded to so heavily with movies like The Florida Project and Red Rocket. I do think the Departed comparison there is pretty apt. I guess the only difference is really just more of a taste thing. I think The Departed is a very entertaining but empty movie. I would not call Anora an empty movie.
I agree.
If hypothetically they came out in the same year, Anora would be head over heels above The Departed in my ranking list. I still
same.
like it.
Totally with you.
Yeah. So I guess that's maybe the only disparity there, but I see your point. I think it's a very fair point. I think the thing with me and Anora and my relationship with the movie in general, it's going to be one of those things where I just have to sit back and maybe learn to accept that this is meant to be more of a physical and emotional experience as opposed to a topical one like his previous films were. And when I can come to those terms, I'll probably end up liking the film more because, like I said, I enjoyed the experience enough to say that it is still one of my favorite experiences of the year. I do think it is that good of a movie. But I'm just trying to make sure we temper these expectations and the hype surrounding it because I do think Sean Baker, has made better movies. But I do think where the film works is as an emotional experience, especially when we get to that ending, which we'll certainly talk about. But Mikey Madison does she commands the screen. She is electric.
Absolutely.
She's funny. She's at times very vulnerable, but also very physical and violent. Like sometimes all of the above in a single scene and in a single moment. I appreciate the volatility of her performance and how it does go there. And she's certainly up for the challenge when the film is divulging in its more comedic tendencies, especially in that midpoint when it does turn into basically a slapstick crime thriller. A lot of people have said this is basically like if Pretty Woman became Uncut Gems at the midpoint. And that's I can't take credit for that. I
do see that. Yeah, I think that is an apt comparison for sure.
Yeah, but what I like about Anora and the way it treats its comedy first off, some of it's pretty surprising. I did not expect it to be as silly as it was, but it also lingers in the situational comedy. Oftentimes we see movies like this that are very comedic in nature that involve, criminal dealings, some type of criminal activity in a way that they tend to cut sequences short, but much of the back half of Anora almost feels like one long continuous scene. And really lingers in the moments in between that most of these types of movies don't normally give us. So if there's anything that Sean Baker's doing as far as challenging the audiences here, as opposed to maybe just the topical nature of it, he's challenging the form of what these types of romantic comedies can be. And I think it's a really interesting way of creating sort of a new narrative shift with these types of movies. And I think the movie is very entertaining.
Yeah, I do think in some ways this is his version of Get Out, Jordan Peele, and the way he made Get Out. I thought about that film a lot with Anora because I do think in some ways, even though I do think the Florida Project and Red Rocket, as we've been talking about, I do think ultimately those are more challenging films that are perhaps more provocative and rich thematically.
Yeah.
But that said, I do think Anora does get to have its cake and eat it too, in the same way that Jordan Peele did with Get Out, as it being a horror film and a comedy simultaneously.
Yeah.
Because this film, Anora, as we've been talking about, it is extremely diverting. It is really, really fun. However, I do think that ending scene recontextualizes this film to become a Sean Baker movie that I have really come to appreciate. Now, I want to dig into this, so forgive me as I ramble on here, but I do want to dissect that a little bit further, right? So we get to that final scene of the film, and I love the framing of it. Spoilers here, I guess. I need to talk about the scene. It completely makes the movie for me. So I can't avoid specificity here. I have to talk about it. So spoilers.
Is it the ending of the year?
For the ending. For me, it might be. It really well might be.
Yeah, I thought about that. It might be for me as well.
Yes, and as I noted in my opening thoughts, it does make this movie for me. So I do want to talk about it. Spoilers for the final scene of Anora. I love the framing of this final moment because, one, it's the only time she initiates sex that isn't transactional, at least not financially. You could argue that it's an emotional transaction and that she's repaying his kindness, but I don't know if I buy that personally. I think it's much more compelling emotionally and thematically that she chooses this consensually as a human being, something that we had not seen her do to this point in the film. Regardless, the framing is engrossing given how sex has defined her life and her career, and it's what led to that moment there with Igor. But then suddenly it becomes a vacuum for catharsis for her. A stunning visual as she leans there into Igor, the way she breaks down, the embrace between the two of them. It is really, really moving. But what's driving that emotion? What's driving that emotion? It is the accumulative trauma of being tied up and held hostage for a moment of time, the urgency of finding Ivan and convincing him of their marriage, the coercion of his family, and the ultimate betrayal of Ivan. No doubt those experiences took a significant toll on her. There's also a layer of Annie suppressing her emotion throughout the film. She rarely relents in that fierce exterior. She doesn't want to be seen as weak or helpless, and that repressed emotion also takes its toll. But for me, I think there's arguably something more powerful at play, something kind of innocent, but it will stronghold a young person. Maybe more than anything, I'll be curious to hear her thoughts. Maybe more than anything, it's that she doesn't want to accept the reality that she fell for a childish prank. Because a lot of her choices throughout this film are naive and myopic. I mean, I don't think Annie is that obtuse. surely she understood what the deal was the moment Ivan abandoned her at the mansion. And yet, she is just as desperate to find him as Toros is. She vehemently defends her marriage to him, even though they've only known each other for a week.
Yeah.
Part of it could be the fantasy of wealth. Annie obviously lives a modest life in New York City, and the idea of marrying into a Russian oligarch family would be intoxicating.
For sure.
But more than that, I think she simply feels humiliated. And instead of admitting that to herself, she tells herself the lie that they've married for love and they're going to stay together forever, which she barks constantly throughout this film.
She's trying to convince herself of that as opposed to just everyone else.
She's trying to convince herself as much as anyone else. I completely agree. And it is naive. And I think that naivete is born out of a deep, mortified shame, something that many, if not most, young people have experienced in one way or another. Maybe not that extreme, but when you're young, you make crazy choices and bad mistakes. And there's a scene in this film where it pauses for a moment to relish on just how young they are. They talk about their ages specifically.
Yeah.
And
she's
I don't think that was
25 and he's 21, I think, is what they say about themselves.
Was she 25 or 23? I think 23. She's 23. He jokes that he would have guessed that she was 25.
That's it.
So
You're
she's
right.
just
You're
23. Right. He's 20 or whatever he says there. They're both really, really young. And I think that choice or so much of what she does is simply born out of that naivete. And instead of relinquishing the choices that she made and just be like, okay, I fell for this. Instead of just owning that, she falls further and further and further into the bit to the point where she has no choice but to just fully commit to it. And she does. And I think as a result, once we see how things play out in the end with her parents, the marriage, the annulment, when she gets into that car there with Igor and he makes one simple gesture, a gesture of kindness, something genuine, something empathetic that she hadn't experienced at all throughout this entire film, I think it just broke her. And that to me is so Sean Baker. That's a Sean Baker move that makes this movie
that's
a Sean
Florida
Baker
Project
movie.
all over again.
Yeah.
That's Brooklyn Prince and Bria Venete all over again, right? Yeah. And I do think your reading is perhaps complementary to maybe the primary reading I was taking from that ending, but I do think they work simultaneously. I think one could arguably be sort of a byproduct of the other. And maybe that realization that Annie is having is also realizing that people like her are really just at the mercy of the capitalist dollar, right? And like she is just seen as this worker, this lower level individual, right? That's something that they talk about a little bit more indirectly, not quite as directly, but the fact that it's also weirdly paralleling those that work for this Russian oligarch, just simply the goons here, they're workers here doing a job. There is a parallel there. And it's why that when we spend time at this Russian oligarch's house, which is, it's his house, but Ivan claims to own it just because he's the one that's, he's the son, right?
But
so he just lives there and spends his money. When we're there, there's all this constant emphasis on the help, right? Those that clean up the after party. And I think in many ways, that naivete at the end for Annie could also be traced back to this realization that for so long, she has been at the mercy of those with money, right? She has constantly seen generosity as a form of payment, right? That's how that's how they provide care and generosity. And while this last exchange between her and Igor isn't monetarily transactional, in a way, maybe it kind of is when he does give her the ring, but it's more in good faith than it is in payment. But
exactly,
there is an irony to that.
That's why I noted that a moment ago. Like, it could be seen as an emotional transaction, but I don't buy it as like I don't think she initiates the sex because of the transaction. I think it's,
No,
as you
no,
noted,
but
it's in good faith.
but it's provided with a sense of irony as a film. I think Sean
Yes,
Baker does
yes,
that
exactly.
deliberately because he's trying to
Yes,
provide that sense
100%.
of irony.
Yeah.
But I think that realization that Annie has, that naivete of feeling duped, like you're talking about, I think also is in relation to how maybe taken advantage she has felt throughout
Yeah.
this experience,
Yep.
and maybe how maybe that's something that she has secretly felt without realizing it throughout her career. It's something
exactly.
that these workers all feel, I think.
And that's exactly why, and I completely agree with you. And in terms of Sean Baker getting to have his cake and eat it too, and
Yeah.
ultimately why I do come around to this film in a way that I did not anticipate as I was watching it in real time.
Mhm.
Because it is really fun. It's hilarious. I love the fiery personas here. I love the crackling dialogue. There is so much to enjoy in terms of the form, but it's not until we get to that final scene where so much of this film is recontextualized.
I was waiting for
And
that shoe to drop.
was
There's always a
waiting for the
moment.
shoe to
There's always,
drop.
because
And-
getting
and
to
it's-
that point, it
Yes,
was getting
yeah.
a little repetitive for me at times, and it was just I was waiting for that shoe to drop where it's like, okay, Sean Baker has something to say. Where is it? Oh,
Yes, and
there it
and
is.
Once, exactly, and once it does, I think it makes more sense. Where the Florida Project and on Rocket, you can see the thematic richness of the film as it goes, and you can see the layers and the
Yeah.
mechanics working together to create these really lush and melancholic and
They
just
they
radiant
build on
movies.
themselves, right?
They
Moment
build on
by moment.
themselves.
This one's more of a magic trick in a way.
It's a flood at the end.
Yeah.
But that flood, what it does is, in hindsight, you go back and you rewatch this film through the perspective of that flood you get at the end, and that's where the richness of this film really comes in. Because I do think when when you think about Sean Baker, he is one of the most humanist filmmakers working today, right?
Absolutely.
All of his films explore the marginalized majority of America and their attempts to find joy and peace inside of tragedy. That is this film.
Yeah.
Anora is no different in that regard. It arguably ends on a more overtly dour note than even the Florida Project or Red Rocket. And as it relates to classism specifically, I completely agree. I love the parallels of Anora to the help of the mansion, but even more specifically, Igor and Toros as they simply work for the oligarch family as well. They're really no
They have
different.
their own jobs
in
outside
terms of
of
the
that.
hierarchy. They're no different.
Yeah,
Really?
Toros has his own job as a priest or something like that, right?
Yes.
He's doing a baptism, and because he is being called upon by this Russian oligarch, he has to put that aside. He has to put his family aside for these people that simply have more money, right? So,
Yeah,
like,
and that's-
it's really interesting stuff. In any other movie, these goons would be seen as quote unquote bad guys, but
They're
they
henchmen,
have-
absolutely.
they're
And I
henchmen,
want to
yeah.
talk about that in a second, but to stay on point here for a moment to finish this thought on Annie, especially. Like how she becomes a victim of capitalism and again, perhaps a victim of her naivete. I agree with you. Like my interpretation of the film, how that bleeds into what you're saying there. I think the two are very much in alignment because she is working against fighting fiercely. I mean, I love the opening of this film when she's going through the club and trying to get all of these guys that would pay her money to do these dances for.
Yeah, perfect bookends for this movie. Opens with a dance, ends with a dance.
Ends with a dance.
Yeah.
Completely agree. So her modest lifestyle makes sense of why she would be drawn to Igor and the money, especially.
Yeah.
That part you wholly empathize with, but on an emotional level, how it forces her into that naivete, I think is really incredible. And throughout the film, like when you're watching it in real time, you don't realize the strings that Sean Baker is pulling there because it's so it's emphasizing that comedy so much.
Yeah.
It's emphasizing the absurdity of the story so much that it's easily overlooked. But once you get to that final scene and the way he unravels everything here, you look back at it in hindsight and you're like, okay, no, this is absolutely a classic Sean Baker film where he is once again toying with those themes of class. And given how this plays out, and I guess since we've already kind of been in spoilers here, the rich win. Shocking.
Yeah.
The people with all the money walk away with exactly what they want at the end of this. And the people that don't have the money are left broken and vulnerable.
Yeah.
And if that doesn't define Sean Baker, I don't know what does.
Yeah, that's why he's able to have it both ways. And I think that's why I'm going to learn to respect this movie more if I look at it as, really what it's doing for the romantic comedy genre, right? I think if you see this movie for the first time without really having any knowledge of Sean Baker, this is going to feel like a revelatory experience, right? I think it would. For those of us like you and I, we have that context with Sean Baker, which is why we're sort of doing this compare and contrast between the provocative nature of, let's say, Red Rocket, which is still to this day a movie I don't recommend to like anybody, but I absolutely love it. Anora is kind of the opposite. I can recommend this one to a lot of people, and I think they may enjoy it. But I think it's going to feel like a very new type of film for them, which is kind of a neat thing to see. But I think by the time it does get to the end, because it is sort of twisting the traditional genre tropes that many people might come to expect here, ending it in this way is going to allow it to emotionally stick more. And I think people will come away feeling like they learned something. And I think it will feel insightful in that regard. I do. Yeah. Sean Baker knows what he's doing. And this one does
never
feel
have doubted him.
This one does feel like a curtain slowly opening by the end, as opposed to, like we talked about with the Florida Project or Red Rocket. Those movies have thematic and sociopolitical subtext that kind of builds on itself scene by scene and reveals itself in a grand way that's like, oh yeah, it was going in that direction. Not the case with Anora. In a way, it's almost like a twist ending. like it just like given the way it just jumps out.
It really is. Yeah. I mean, because I don't think this film is all that rooted emotionally until that final scene. Now there are some teases throughout, and maybe that is a great transition to Igor, because not only is he surprisingly the nucleus of the film emotionally in a lot of ways, but it's also key to what you were saying in terms of Sean Baker and how he is experimenting with the form here with certain tropes. Because this is a movie, and I love this about Anora, it subversively undermines the henchman trope with this character, with Igor. I mean, he is an imposing figure physically. When we first meet him, we are told that he's here in case, or at the mansion, he's there in case Ivan's friends are there, inferring that Igor is the enforcer of this group. But that's not why Sean Baker includes him in this movie. Igor might check all the boxes as a cliche henchman type on the surface, which is purposeful, obviously. But what makes him so compelling is that he sees something in Annie that no other character does. He's the only one here that sees her vulnerabilities. Annie herself doesn't notice it much, but Baker, as a filmmaker, goes out of his way to make sure that we, as the audience, see what Igor is seeing in Annie, which gives him this fascinating underbelly of empathy, something totally unexpected for a henchman character, but it is the only thing tethering this film to any sort of emotional undercurrent. And I love those moments here. Borisov sells them incredibly well. I mean, you talk about one of the best surprising performances of the year. He is hands down the leader in the doghouse for that category. It is an unbelievable performance.
He might give my favorite performance in the movie, even if I do recognize that Mikey Madison has the most challenging role. So it's perhaps a better performance because of the physicality of it. But I really responded to that cryptic nature in Igor. And a lot of that, of course, is from Sean Baker and how he chooses to portray the character. But it is also in Borisov's performance because he does have that secret tender quality you're alluding to, but he'll also at times, at least in one particular scene, fully divulge in what you'd expect a henchman like this to represent, and has
Yeah.
one of my all-time favorite destroying a room scenes that I think I've ever seen.
Yeah.
The candy store with the aluminum baseball bat.
Just the way he takes the bat, like that alone was like, okay,
Yeah.
you can't mess with this guy.
Yeah, but the way he does it, it's almost like a switch went off. Like, this is someone you don't want to upset, but it also looks like he has done this many times before.
Yeah.
So it weirdly does add a layer, despite it just being very physically entertaining to watch. And that's his performance, adding a multitude of layers in just one single scene like that. It's really impressive.
Yeah, it's really quite remarkable. There's another film that did a similar-ish thing earlier this year. It's one that you haven't had a chance to see yet, so I don't necessarily want to talk about it quite yet, but it's an action film. And I thought about it a lot with this movie as well, because oftentimes we see movies. Now, this plays out like more, I guess, of a rom-com, but Igor is representative of any henchman you've seen in any film ever, regardless of type. Think the John Wick movies, Batman, whatever it may be. These henchmen characters, we never know their names. They simply come and go. They get, killed, often with no regard. And that's ultimately who we're looking at here. But Sean Baker he wants to peel beneath that. He wants to show the humanity of that character. They're not just someone that exists to be killed by John Wick. This is a real person that has real feelings and real nuances. And how Baker goes about doing that here, I think, is really great. And even the establishment of him, right? Because, again, we're told that he is an enforcer. So we expected him to be imposing physically. And not only do we get it in the scene that you're referencing there in the store, but that first moment with Annie, right, where he even introduces himself. He's the henchman. He's just here to do his job, but he introduces himself. When she starts acting erratically, he has to grab her and tie her down, but he does it so begrudgingly. He doesn't want to do this. He doesn't want to hurt her.
Even though he may injure her in the process. She talks about the bruises that she has, so that's a fair question to ask. Was he being abusive? Like there is a layer there.
And that is something that is brought up later on in the film. So I do like that the film wrestles with that addresses it, because it doesn't excuse the fact that he does tie her up, that he does, in a sense, kidnap her or hold her hostage at any rate. He is physically holding her down in a way that is, again, you could argue the morality of that. But again, there's an emphasis in the filmmaking from Baker's perspective to show us that from Igor's perspective, he's not doing this because he wants to hurt her. He's simply doing his job. He is reserved. He is reserved in it. And as the film goes, you see that empathy. He's the only character that sees the vulnerabilities in Annie throughout. And I absolutely love how that comes about in this film. And then it crystallizes in that final moment where, again, he doesn't ask for that. Like, Annie initiates that moment of intimacy. And when it's not until he starts to engage with it where she starts to succumb emotionally. And I love that Igor, even in that final scene, like, to him, it was never about the intimacy, right? Because the moment he breaks or she breaks down, he embraces her. Like full on just wants to hold her and take care of her. Just culminating that empathy we had seen from him throughout. And the way that
it's a great ending. It's such a great ending. He even says a few times that this is just a job, I think. So the film is very direct in that regard.
On his birthday, which I love
on his
that
birthday. As much as I love the ending of this movie, the scene before the ending, I guess, like, if you want to call the ending more of a coda, the final scene between the two of them at the house is
when they're just watching TV there.
Yeah, the conversation
Yeah.
they have, that's equally just as thrilling, if
I
not maybe
agree.
more so, but for different reasons. At least it perfectly sets up where the film is going to conclude. I think it does great setup in that regard.
Mhm.
But yeah, the conversation that they have, the realness of it, I think is pretty great. It also ends with a really great callback to a certain punchline that really should not
Yeah.
have worked, but
Mhm.
it I
Yeah,
think
it's
it
so
does
good.
stick the landing, maybe thanks to Mikey Madison and her
Oh,
delivery
she's
of
so
that
good. She
particular
delivers it
joke.
impeccably. Yeah.
It's so good. Yeah.
I do love how Baker somewhat toys with your allegiances there, or
Hmm.
perhaps the mystery of how this is going to end, because the major conflict at that point is already done. They
Yeah.
have lost the battle.
Yeah.
Annie is at home.
Yeah.
She is
Like, where do you
going
go
to
from
end
here? The
up,
movie's kind of over, right?
the movie
At
is
least
kind of
like the
over.
main narrative is done.
Exactly. So how does Sean Baker stick the landing layer? Like how is he going to end, or how is he going to land the plane?
Yeah.
And they have that fascinating conversation where again it's brought up like, hey, you like held me down, like tied
Yeah.
me up, held me hostage.
Yeah. Yeah.
And again, like that's where Borisov's performance is so incredible to me, because he acknowledges that that's what he did, but there is a sense of innocence to him, that he was
Mhm.
just doing his job. He wasn't trying to hurt her. And in that moment, she was being also, again, physically erratic, which
Yeah.
anyone would in that moment, because you're being tied down,
course.
held hostage.
Of course.
So she's
Yeah.
slapping him. She's punching Igor. At one point, I forget the other character's name, like breaks his nose, goes
Oh yeah,
after.
Garnick, played by I have
Yeah.
his name here because I want to highlight him as perhaps the he's basically the jester of this movie,
Yes.
right? He's
Yeah.
the class clown.
Yeah.
He's not literally a clown, obviously, but in many ways he's kind of the comedic relief, just given the nature of it. He's played by
Yeah.
I'm probably going to mispronounce this, but I at least want to give him some credit. Vache Tovmasian. He is also very funny, especially just considering
Oh yeah, he's
the fact that
hilarious.
his character
Yeah.
arc is basically just slowly succumbing to his concussion. That's
Yeah,
basically his
that's it.
character arc.
That's all. All he's there for.
Yeah.
By the end of the film, nothing changes with that character. He's
It's like
just
you think,
concussed the whole time.
this guy should be in the hospital.
Yeah,
And then it gets
he's
even
got
worse. Like,
major
why isn't
CTE.
he in the hospital? It gets
Yeah.
worse and worse, but to
It
the
gets-
point
yeah.
where it's hard to find myself laughing at someone's pain like that. But it's maybe it's
It
just
is- but it is
it's
really
great
funny.
editing. It's great editing, I think,
I
is really what
agree.
it does. Yeah.
And that goes back to what we were saying earlier, as far as the film being so diverting, aggressively comedic. It is almost slapstick at times, but I completely agree. It's a great performance. I really enjoy the character. But yeah, all of it starts in that moment when Igor is holding her down, because she had punched Igor a couple of different times. Then
Yeah.
she kicks Garnick in the face, concusses him,
Breaks his nose. Yeah.
and then also goes after Toros as well. So, like, it's understandable that Annie would behave the way she does, but from Igor's perspective, because she is acting erratically, that's why
Yeah.
he ties her down. So it becomes a vicious circle in that way. But
Yeah.
that is to say, at the end of the film, while he acknowledges that that's what he's done, like in his performance, you do sense that innocence in him. He still has empathy for Annie, given what she had gone through. He's the only one that sees that vulnerability in her at all. But that back and forth, it does make you wonder, what does the film think about Igor? What does Sean Baker think about him? Because I wasn't sure if the film was going to return the favor. Was he going to, speaking of Baker, was he, as the storyteller, going to show empathy to him as well? Like, those are questions that I do think the film wants to stir there in that final moment.
Yeah.
And then you get to that final scene. And again, like, where is this going to go? You know, he's dropping her off at her old apartment. He gets out her bags. He's waiting for her to get out of the car. She doesn't get out of the car. And then he makes that great gesture there with the ring, and it just completely overwhelms her. It takes a moment for that emotion to really come to the surface, because she had suppressed it,
Yeah.
throughout the entire film to that point.
Yeah.
But once it comes out, as we noted, they have that great embrace, and it's just absolutely phenomenal. But I think up until that literally the final moment, you're not sure what the film thinks of Igor.
There's a sense there's a suspenseful nature to it. Like you're not sure
Yeah.
where it's going to go. And even though Sean Baker does sort of, not even sort of, he gives us an answer around Igor, but he does so in a way without absolving those lingering ambiguities that we had earlier. We still find ourselves pondering on those things. It's not like it fully forgives him, I'll simply say.
No.
Yeah, and I think that's what's complex about it.
I agree. And I think he's able to do that without undermining Annie and her catharsis there either.
Yeah.
I do think it becomes about both of them. And I think that's why the embrace there at the end is fantastic. And maybe why they embrace each other so much, because despite coming at it from very different perspectives, obviously, but again, emphasizing those parallels you talked about earlier in terms of classism and how they're both, Igor and Annie,
there's a hidden understanding between the two of them that they haven't realized.
In terms of the hierarchy, they're kind of coming at it from the same level.
Yeah.
And seeing what this wealthy family is capable of, how easily they're able to puppeteer this situation.
Yeah.
And see the vulnerabilities in each other. That's, again, it was never about the physical intimacy of that moment.
Mm-hmm.
Although, again, I appreciate Sean Baker's, framing. I think framing that final sequence as a sexual encounter, I do think is great poetry.
Yeah.
But it really is more about the emotional understanding that they have there.
Yeah.
And it's absolutely breathtaking.
I think just given our conversation here, JD, for a movie that's called Anora, I feel like the movie should have been called Igor.
Igor and Anora.
Yeah. Maybe that'll be the sequel.
Yeah. I want to see where do these characters end up?
They join the New York mob and go after the Russian oligarch family.
Maybe. Yeah. That would be fantastic. I would love to see that. Maybe you can do it like Ocean's 12 style.
Oh my gosh. Why isn't Sean Baker making an Ocean's movie? Everyone was talking about Edward Berger doing it, but no, let's have Sean Baker do it after
Sean
this
Baker.
one.
I think he could absolutely do it based off of what this film is.
Yeah.
I absolutely love this film. And I love those interactions. Again, I don't want to oversell the emotion, because it really is those final two scenes.
Yeah, it is.
As we're talking about, this film has a lot of energy. There are a lot of wisecracking one-liners here. But throughout the film, there are these moments where Baker pauses to show us Igor and how he's able to understand Annie. Because I think of also that moment on the boardwalk where he offers her the scarf. And even though to her it's the symbol of being tied up, and again, she's right. She's
right.
Totally
she's not wrong.
But he's doing it in good faith, not because it's a symbol of, this is what I used to tie you up. He understands that she's freezing her ass off and wants to comfort her. So again, it's moments like that build upon each other throughout the film that give such credence to that final moment that I just absolutely adore. So
yeah. I agree with that as well. And I had a thought there. I was trying to see where I wanted to go with that. But what I was going to say was that while I do think the final two scenes are really where the film's emotional core reveals itself, the movie isn't devoid of emotion leading up to that, because I do think Annie and Ivan have great chemistry for that first half. It's a very different type. It's a different type of emotionality that it's going for. It's more charming and fun, and certainly setting up a very different type of movie that the film ends up being. But I do think there are moments here. It's just like it really reveals itself by the end, and then it's like, oh, that's what it's doing. Okay, interesting stuff.
I mean, there's certainly a great energy to the first half of the film in terms of Anora and Ivan, because that's the relationship you're talking about there. As they're, they meet there in the club, then they have the parties at the mansion, and credit to Mark Edelstein and his performance as well, because
that could have gotten so tiring, but it doesn't.
As far as
it does, but it does in the right way.
And I agree. Like, as far as invoking the prodigal son, he does such a phenomenal job of that.
Yeah, I
because
agree.
He is a clueless 20-year-old who just wants to party and nothing else. And I think that is really important, maybe underratedly important, I think, because when he abandons Anora, and again, they've only been together for a week. That's it. They've only known each other for a week when they get married there in Vegas. But because of the chemistry that you're talking about and the fun they're having, and it seems as if this is something that can last forever. But Edelstein does such a great job of making that work and giving credence to it that is necessary for that naivete in Annie, as I talked about earlier. Because there really is no logical explanation for why she would believe that any of this was real. Again, like, it's ridiculous. It's so absurd. And you want to believe that Annie isn't that obtuse. And I don't think that she is. I think she's smart. I think she knows exactly what she's doing. That is evident in the early scenes of the film as she's navigating throughout the club and she's able to take these guys back. And
this is what makes her likable, right? This is what makes Mikey Madison's performance really good, is that despite that naivete, despite that she's doing things that many people might find unclean, I'll simply say, there is something in her performance that you do latch on to. I loved watching her on screen, and that is where I guess there is still some emotionality to this movie and just how like endearing that she is to watch. Like, there is an endearing quality to her despite the circumstances she finds herself in. There's a sincerity to her interaction with it, right? And I think that's really key for the movie, especially working and leading up to those final scenes. It's another one of those cases where if the lead performance doesn't work, then the movie doesn't really work, at least for most of it, right? I think she's great here.
No, I completely agree. I think she's fantastic. Again, I love the chemistry of her and Edelstein there early on. And again, Edelstein and his performances, it is as funny and diverting and absurd as it is. I do think it is important in giving credence to the choices that Annie makes throughout the film, which is really great. I mean, this is the film that could have been a disaster if it was in the hands of anyone else, because tonally this film is kind of all over the place. Especially when you consider the extremes. I mean, this film, it's a slapstick comedy at its most extreme from a diverting perspective.
And then tonal balancing is a real thing.
Dour. So just phenomenal craftsmanship here. And you know, we've been talking a lot about these characters and the themes of the film and how it all kind of comes together. But I do want to highlight, I think the editing is quite great. There's a lot of editing early on in those montages as they're partying, and
by Sean Baker as well.
Yeah,
he's the editor.
Of course.
He's kind of a one-man show, right?
Yeah. Love the editing here. Love the cinematography. The opening credits of this film, you talked about how the ending, it is maybe the ending of the year. I think the opening credits is also a contender for best opening credits scene of the year as well.
I think there's something we can pretty much guarantee every single time a Sean Baker film comes out. The opening credits are going to be among the best opening credits of the year.
Yeah.
It's the way
opening
that
credits and the final scene, slappers. Every single time.
Going back to the opening credits, they're usually pretty simple. They usually linger on some type of long take, or they're not really edited in a way that's like overtly clever, but it's the way that the words on screen and the credits themselves match with the song choice, match with the music. They almost feel music video like. Even something as simple as the opening credits for the Florida Project, which utilized Celebration by Kool and the Gang.
Yeah.
It's just a purple wall that you're watching, but every time the text change, it's to the beat of the song. Simple little things like that just weirdly feel kind of magical. I love the way he handles that.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. And the opening credits here just immediately immerse us into Annie's work and who she is and what she does for a living. It's fantastic. Absolutely love it. So I think the craft here is off the charts. It's fantastic. I don't know where this is going to rank for me as far as my year-end list goes. because I do want to wrestle further with this film, that ending, the way it recontextualizes everything as we've been talking about. It absolutely does give the film a heft that I did not experience in real time. And maybe that's why I'm deeply excited to go back and hopefully get a chance to revisit this before we do our top 10 at the end of the year. Because I think with that in mind, going back and rewatching this film, knowing where it goes in that final scene, I think there's going to be a little bit of that Arrival thing where you go back and you're like, oh my gosh, the clue was right there the whole time.
Yeah.
Like you just got to miss it because it's so chaotic on the surface.
It is. Yeah.
No, I look forward to going back and doing that exercise.
And that's the thing with me, because I think I mentioned at some point during this conversation, there are a few points during the movie before it gets to that ending where I did think to myself, okay, maybe this is getting a little bit repetitive. There is a little wash, rinse, repeat kind of happening here with some of these sequences. I think about the sequence in Vegas before they actually get married, where it just edits between, oh, a party here. Oh, they're going to sit in the hot tub here and drink. Oh, they're going to go get a massage. Oh, they're going to party in the dining room now. Oh, now they're going to hit at the casinos. Oh, they're going to go outside. It just goes back and forth like that for what feels like 15 minutes. And I'm not sure if it really adds much. I don't feel the sense of progression in some of those sequences. But it might help knowing where the film is going to arrive, that on a rewatch, it might make me not even think about those things. So I might end up liking the final film more, like you're saying.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I'm talking about, because like I didn't really have so much of an issue as far as the film maybe overstaying its welcome in that regard, or not progressing its narrative or its story. But I think because of, and maybe it goes back to what we were saying, and like the film is just so much fun to watch, and these characters are so engrossing that despite the repetitiveness, I was completely with the film on a comedic.
It's not
fun
necessarily
level.
Bad repetition, but I'm with you.
Yeah. But at the same time, again, when you're watching it in real time, it is what kept me distant from engaging with it like a Sean Baker film, like I've been used to since Tangerine, if that makes sense.
That's fair. That makes
and
perfect
that's
sense.
Why, again, as I was watching it in real time, I'm like, man, this is fun. I'm enjoying myself, but this is going to easily be my least favorite of his that I've seen. And then we get those final two scenes, and I'm like, well, goddamn,
Well, I don't know.
Now I don't know anymore. Yeah, and that's why I can't wait to wrestle with this further. I think I can say confidently here that I still prefer the Florida Project quite easily. That is, again, because that's
my
such a
favorite.
masterpiece.
That's my
it's one of the
favorite,
best films of the century. I still probably slightly prefer Red Rocket at this point, but I don't think Anora is all that far behind. I think it is it's kind of right there with still his great works. Right there with Tangerine, right there with Red Rocket. Those final two scenes completely reshaped this movie for me. That I do really love it. It'll likely end up on my top 20 at the very least somewhere. I think it's another one of those classic Sean Baker films that I will come to love for sure.
Good at his job. He's good at his job.
Yeah, absolutely. Look forward to the next one.
Absolutely.
Look forward to the next one.
Ocean's 14.
Yeah. Do you have any final thoughts?
With Anora and Igor, they have to make an appearance.
Yes.
That's the only caveat. I don't want him to direct an Ocean's movie. That's a joke, but we only say that because we'd like to see Anora and Igor show up in a movie like that.
Hey, look, I don't know if I want Sean Baker doing anything, traditional to Hollywood.
No, he doesn't need the IP.
I will say, if anything fits him, I do think it is Oceans. Like that does seem like something he would absolutely destroy. So, if he wants to jump into that world or something, like it, I could get down with that if he ever needs a payday. I think that would be fitting, but we'll see. I mean, hopefully he just keeps making Sean Baker films because that's what I really want from him more than anything else. But.
Yeah, it'll be the Ocean's gang going to rob the the candy store here in Coney Island.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. Like he loves to tackle class, right? Like it's got to be those on the outside. So if anything, like his Ocean's movie would be again those marginalized breaking in to steal. I don't know. Like it's got to be like pushing up against some sort of oligarch, right? Like getting revenge on Ivan and his family, or maybe the next president of the United States.
Yeah, I'm sure he's planning that.
Maybe
already.
him too. Yeah.
Someone I think someone is.
At any rate, before the government starts knocking on my door, I guess we'll go ahead and end the conversation there. If you agree or disagree with anything we had to say, you can leave a comment below if you're watching on YouTube. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, hit us up on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Blue Sky. You can email us in sessionfilm@gmail.com as well. All right, stay tuned. We have another review coming this week as we will be talking about Steve McQueen's Blitz, another film that we've been looking forward to this year.
Yeah.
Episode 610 is available right now. We do a ranking of Clint Eastwood, a consensus ranking. Brendan and I figured out his top 10 best movies as a director.
His official list. It's official list. So no one can disagree. This is the right answer. These are his top 10 movies.
Exactly. We talk a little Star Wars. We talk a little Mission Impossible. It was a great time.
Yep.
Go and check that out. We'll have a new Chasing the Gold this week. We'll have new Women in Session as well. So be on the lookout for that as well. With that, thanks for listening, everybody. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time on the In Session Film Podcast. Mikey Madison. Real good. Really, really good.